Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming out. It's early on a Saturday morning, but this is to be an incredibly important session and one that's it's going to be great to host. My name is Richard Davies. I'm the economics editor of The Economist. And for me, this session, which is about will the robots eat all the jobs, really reflects a kind of bipolar attitude that economists have towards technology. Keynes, perhaps the father of modern economics, wrote about something he called the disease of technological unemployment, which was that advances in technology were going to mean that we didn't need people to work, and so unemployment rose. It's a well-known phenomenon in economics. Just as well-known, I think, in sort of business schools, is Henry Ford and his production line, where one day Henry Ford just realized that rather than having the workers move from car to car to car, if you had the workers staying still and the cars moving, productivity shot up. So the big question for me is technology a good thing or a bad thing? Does it raise our productivity, lower costs, and promise cheap goods? Or are the robots and the technology that are being developed going to destroy employment? To answer these questions, on my far left is Debra Howcroft. She's a professor at Manchester Business School, and she's the editor of the journal New Technology, Work and Employment. On my left is Bridget Rosewell. She's a senior advisor at Volterra Partners, is an economic consultancy. On my right, I have Gavin Kelly. He's chief executive of the Resolution Foundation and an ex-deputy chief of staff at number 10 Downing Street. And on my far right, we're lucky to have Diane Coyle, who's running the festival this year. She runs Enlightenment Economics. If people don't read her blog, you should do. It's one of the best places to learn about new books, particularly on economics. And her latest book on GDP, perhaps the foundation of what we do when we analyze economies, is a great read. So with that, we'll start off with a little introduction from each of our speakers. And to kick us off, Debra, please.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So today I'd like to start by addressing the question, will the robots eat all the jobs, by looking at an illustration. The illustration is Amazon Mechanical Turk. So could I just start by asking you to raise your hand if you're familiar with Mechanical Turk? Yeah. So a few people in the audience. So Mechanical Turk is a crowd employment platform. I'm sure many of you have heard of crowdfunding, but crowd employment is perhaps less familiar. So in contrast with the image of humans being replaced by robots, this involves the scaling up of minuscule data processing tasks carried out by workers via the internet. So it still uses the technology. And these crowd employment platforms enable companies to outsource functions traditionally performed by internal employees. And the tasks are so small that it involves things like online surveys, transcription, tagging of online images. And in Amazon's case, Mechanical Turk sits within the broad digital platform that we're all familiar with. And Mechanical Turk originated when Amazon were concerned that they had a lot of duplicate product pages. And so this was a task that was difficult for computers to actually spot the similarities. And so they thought it's much easier if we outsource the work, almost like piecework, and ask people to spot this for us at a very low rate. And the concept Mechanical Turk is based on an 18th century chess player who used to tour Europe, playing chess with the elites and beating the elites. And it was seen to be a robot, so an automaton, but within the actual box itself was a human being. So the Mechanical Turk represents the image of the human within the computer. When Jeff Bezos announced Mechanical Turk to an audience, he said, "You've heard of software as a service. Now this is human as a service." So the way in which it works is that there's a whole kind of global base of workers, and when it was initially launched, they were just typically representative of US internet users. So it was US-based, so they tended to be people with, say, caring responsibilities, the unemployed, the underemployed. It then internationalized, So instead of just paying in US dollars, they started to pay in Indian rupees. So these are the two kinds of currencies in which you can be paid. For a lot of the Indian workers, it then became a full-time job. Average hourly rate is around $2 an hour, so well below minimum wage. And if you don't want to be paid in dollars or rupees, you can be paid in Amazon gift certificates. So Amazon are literally printing their own global currency. In terms of the requesters, the people that use the service, Amazon recognized that obviously one of the difficulties with these kind of micro tasks and this global workforce is how do you manage it? How do you manage it effectively? So we see this whole level of mediator firms that have sprung up. And the mediator firms work on behalf of other companies. So these companies include people like Walmart, Coca-Cola, the US Department of Defense, Procter & Gamble, LinkedIn are all over this, Elle Magazine. And so they literally go through these mediation companies and then have links to the workers. So there's a whole growth of companies that manage this. In terms of the workforce, it's global and it offers skills and experience. It's very scalable, it's very flexible, it's outside any remit of traditional employment regulations, and there's absolutely no security. 25% of the tasks are valued at less than 1 penny, 70% pay less than 4 pence, and 90% pay less than 6 pence. The requester who posts the task can reject the work without justification and without payment, but they still retain ownership of that work. Workers are seen as independent contractors, so these are the new entrepreneurs, but they're really just micro-earners. So they're not entitled to any of the benefits of Amazon employees or the employees of those companies that are employing them. So I'd like to raise a question, why bother replacing workers with robots when you can operate in this way? In terms of crowd employment platforms, there's estimates of around 10 million people working on these kinds of platforms. So when you've got large numbers of workers, it's highly scalable at speed, firms can sidestep regulations, payment is discretionary, there's no costly employee infrastructure. There's no moral or social obligation entailed in this. The onus of responsibility for productivity lies with the workers themselves. And if anyone's feeling slightly guilty about this or has a slight concern with their own conscience, then at least you can, you only deal with workers through alphanumeric identifiers, so that it kind of renders the workers invisible through the process. So just to sum up, I'd like to just raise a couple of questions in this context. Firstly, technology does not affect all inputs equally, and it's a mistake to assume that graduate jobs are hard to automate. It's not about automating low-skilled jobs, but it depends on what tasks machines can do better than humans. And so in this respect, certain jobs like financial analysis and hairdressing are safe. It's also about weighing up the relative costs of automating each type of input and thinking about the effects on quality, reliability, and outputs. So those decisions are affected by who the workers are. So if you're dealing with part-time, low-paid women workers compared to high-paid, high-skilled male workers in highly unionized organizations, those decisions are going to be different. So it's very much subject to labour markets and broader socio-economic context. If you think about call centres and the movement of work, in times of austerity, we initially saw the movement of work to India. As those kind of locations became overheated, it then shifted to the Philippines, and now people are moving work back here. And that's because it's easier and cheap to pay people in places like Burnley in the northeast. So issues of control and coordination of the unruly elements of production, living labour, are what are seen as particularly problematic. So while employers can buy labour capacity, there is no surety as to how that capacity will function. And those decisions all feed into those decisions about whether or not to move to robots. So for me, this kind of decision to automate is not just an economic decision, but it's very much a political decision.
If anyone hasn't had a look at the Amazon Turk website, I encourage you to do so. it's kind of mind-boggling to see the length of the task and the payoff. It's typically 5 cents for what looks to me like sort of an hour's worth of work.
Yeah.
So it's quite striking. Very interesting. Thank you, Bridget.
In one sense, then it's obvious that robots eat your jobs, because if you think of output as being sort of fixed pot out there, then if productivity is going to increase, then output stays the same, productivity increases, there must be fewer people working. So when you get a recession and output is falling, then if the people, depending on what's happening to unemployment, you can get an increase in productivity if you get rid of people fast enough. And if you don't do that, we've just seen that we've had a recession, people haven't lost many jobs, and so productivity has fallen a lot. And that's what's sort of come out in the statistics. We can argue about whether we believe the statistics or not, but there's a kind of statistical circularity about this. People and productivity equals output. So the question is, what do you hold fixed? And the question then becomes, how do you sort of moderate, mitigate the relationships between all of those? And I think that's, for me, is where we think about technology. So 20 years ago, roughly, I guess, early 90s recession, I seem to remember standing up and having exactly these conversations about technology, the emergence of digital just starting back then, how this was going to eat all our jobs. And I remember talking about a book by Kurt Vonnegut, brilliant book called Play a Piano. And it's all about exactly that phenomenon, which was expected to happen in the 1940s and 50s. As manufacturing became automated, the technology would eat our jobs. Everything would be automated. Nobody would have a job in manufacturing. Cars would all be produced, it was all about cars particularly. Cars would all be produced by robots and machines, and people would be reduced to being paid to dig a hole in the road and fill it in again. And it's all, the book is all about digging the hole of the road and how it's organised to fill it in again. And the role, I won't tell you the story. Go and read it. It's great. And Play a Piano plays an important role in it. That turned out not to be true. It turned out that as we automated some forms of activity and product, this liberated other forms of product and service to be generated, and jobs moved from one sort of activity to another sort of activity, and we ended up being better off, having higher incomes, more opportunities, more education available, and indeed more leisure available to us if we chose to take that. So is it different this time? Well, many people think that economists who say it's going to be different this time are usually wrong. So why is it going to be different this time? So isn't it more likely to be the case that the liberation of new technologies and new opportunities makes it possible in the longer run, and we might come back to that in a minute, in the longer run, to generate different forms of activity, new incomes for people who otherwise aren't in the labour market? So in other words, what this does is it increases competition. Competition increases the potential for innovation. And innovation is also about how we all get together to make the best of those opportunities. And perhaps it's that getting together part which is the most important, because I think it's also the challenge, in a way, in all of this, and comes back to what you were talking about. So getting together is... The jargon, is, if you like, is about agglomeration. So as we get together, we are all here today. We're not sitting at a distance, looking at a screen and just doing this on YouTube or whatever, although that's it's being filmed, so you can look at it later. We are actually engaging in a conversation, and out of that conversation comes the ideas which drive new stuff. Half of the population of the world now lives in cities. This is the first. But in those cities, it is possible to organise and it is possible to get together. And I think in the end, as those new things happen, there is a period of disruption, and disruption is very painful. And indeed, there are victims of that disruption whom one needs to think about how best to protect from the consequences of that, as indeed we had in the 80s, when manufacturing industry tanked. There was a period of very painful disruption and a lot of argument about how best to do that. But trying to maintain the status quo was not the answer, could not have worked, and indeed the attempt to do so prolonged the period of pain rather than reducing it. But agglomeration and getting together in cities is actually also about organisation. and that is about organisation of people who are being disrupted and the organisation of the people at the other end of those telephone lines, as much as it is about the organisation of the employment side of this. So I am not a pessimist. I've never been a pessimist, so maybe that just tells you something about me. I'm not a pessimist about the opportunities here. I'm much more interested in how we best organise to take advantage of opportunity rather than resist it.
Thank you. So, pro-robot. Gavin, you pro-robot?
I'm sort of pro-robot. Okay. I'll explain. Thank you.
On the one hand, on the other.
On the one hand, on the other, and we'll see. Time will tell. I'm going to say three things, really, in my brief slot. First, I'm going to contend that I believe it is perfectly possible that new technology and the exponential growth in processing power could fundamentally change the nature of work and wage growth and living standards. There's nothing settled about what people of my age have got used to. I think that's all up for grabs. It's my first contention. Secondly, I want to sort of strike a note of sort of pedantic empirical skepticism about some of the claims made, about some of the changes that have already happened, which I don't fully buy, although there's something in them. And third, I just want to, I suppose, strike a note of cautious pessimism about our capacity to adjust equitably. Not that there is potential for us all to get richer, but just how likely that is, given the current state of our institutional setup in this country, at least. I'll try and skip through this. Tell me if I go on. John Stuart Mill, just before he died in 1873, said that the Industrial Revolution, which had obviously been around for a long time, hadn't really had any impact. That's what he said. And people thought he was completely balmy for saying that. But it captured a truth, which was that between 1800 and 1870, the working class wages grew by 0.4%. From 1870 to 1950, they then tripled before they then hit the kind of 2% wage growth year on year that many of us in the late 20th century had got used to. It takes a long time, often, for what are seen to be fundamental technological changes to end up affecting people's living standards and the nature of their work. Not all people, but I'm talking about in aggregate, in terms of the aggregate macro numbers. And I don't think there's anything, that takes to my point, I don't think there's anything preordained about the sort of, the nature of work and the nature of increases in living standards that we saw in the late 20th century and the early 21st century. In fact, we've found out over the last 10 years that the idea that 2% improvement in our kind of living standards is somehow sacrosanct has already, we've learnt that that's not true, and that's in part because of a deep global recession, but it's not just that. There were problems before it came along. So I suppose what I'm saying is we're still living in the lag in terms of the technologies that we're talking about today. We don't really know how much they're going to change things, and I think that makes it incredibly hard to filter some of the claims made about how sweeping the implications will be for our work, for the nature of employment and for wages. Is too soon to say, which is a kind of statement of the obvious, but it's important to keep in mind. My second point, which is the kind of gentle skepticism about some of the claims made, the traditional view, the dominant view in the UK and elsewhere, is that the shift towards greater automation has been eroding large swathes of jobs that involve repetitive tasks and are easily replaced by robots and others. And this has disproportionately affected roles in the middle of the income distribution, manufacturing, warehousing, administration. And to date, there is no evidence in the UK at all that this is affecting the overall level of employment for the reasons that Bridget has said. That this isn't about the quantity of work on offer. This is about the type of work and relative pay. The standard story is that we've seen a big growth in jobs at the top and a growth in jobs at the bottom and a big collapse in between. More lovely and lousy jobs, if you like. And there's clearly something in this, and my organisation's produced a number of reports which kind of fit with that story. But, and it's an important but, I think some of this gets overstated, in part because we tend, in these studies, not to measure entirely new middle-income jobs. These studies don't really pick them up, and there are a lot of new types of middle-income jobs that weren't around 20 years ago. We've also had rampant job title inflation in this country and other countries, and that confounds all these studies. People who do things which, in the past were kind of middle-skilled jobs are now called high-skilled jobs, and that's a big deal in these studies, and they're very, very bad at controlling for that. That sounds pedantic, but it really affects the results. And I think it's also important to keep a sense of proportion, and you kind of stole my thunder, Bridget, in terms of, I'm old enough to have been at conferences a bit like this 15 years ago, and there is a certain kind of been here before feel to it. Even in the sectors which have been really hit by technology, and there are some skilled trades, administration, the sorts of job falls we've seen over a quarter of a century are about 25%, roughly speaking. Now, that's a big fall. That is a really big fall. But it's not the death of middle-level jobs that I repeatedly read about, which doesn't mean to say it won't change in the future. I'm just talking about what we've lived through over the last few decades. We published a big report from my organisation showing kind of the hollowing out of the labour market since the financial crisis in 2008. And it got written up by others as, here you go, the robots are eating the jobs. And it had bugger all to do with the robots. And the reason why we've had a crash in construction employment, a crash in public administration employment is not that hard to fathom. I mean, we've had deep austerity, we've had an investment strike, we've had a demand-starved economy. I don't think it's so much to do with the robots over the short term. So I'm not saying this stuff isn't happening. I am saying we need a degree of not cynicism, but skepticism about some of the claims made, even though there are some changes in employment which are clearly related to automation. My final point really is about how well prepared are we to handle an adjustment if there is a kind of fundamental shift of the nature of production, if something different is going to happen, and none of us really know, how well set up our institutions in a mature economy like the UK to smooth that transition. And I suppose this is where, I think we would all agree that technology, higher productivity equals richer societies in aggregate, and that is a cause for optimism. There's a lot you can do with that extra wealth that can be created. That's not really up for debate, I would have thought. What's up for debate is how that gets shared out and how we live as a society in that sort of new era. And here, I suppose, I worry. I worry about lots of different things. I worry about a tax system, how robust, how legitimate will a progressive tax system be in an era with ever higher returns to capital, with ever more super managers paying a high proportion of tax? Is that really a sustainable basis to fund the sorts of public services and welfare system that you need? I worry about our educational system. Is it going to supply the kind of creative and analytical skills that we need in this new society? And are we going to have fair access to the kind of applied postgraduate courses, which are 21st century gold in the world that we're talking about? At the moment, we have absolutely nothing like fair access to those opportunities, and I don't see that happening anytime soon. And crucially for me, do we have a welfare system which is capable of supporting both the losers, if there is sort of technological unemployment in the type that Keynes talked about, but actually probably more tellingly, the large numbers of people who will be stuck in low-paid work for a long period of time. That's already the case. I see no reason to think that that's going to go away. Do we even know how to support the incomes of a large swathe of the working population without further creating downward pressure on wages? There is a possibility to get in a vicious cycle of trying to support wages and in doing so actually further creating pressures which undermine them. I could go on in terms of our institutional capacity to adjust. I'm not saying, therefore, doom and gloom and let's give up, and I'm certainly not saying let's be Luddite and try and stop the use of new technology. That's an impossibilist position. That's not my point. My point is how well equipped are we, given our democratic institutions, to adjust? And I think, for me, the glass is probably not half full on that front.
Okay. So, Diane, we've got a completely balanced panel. We've got a red light, green light, amber light.
Yeah,
what's the answer?
How am I going to round it up? There's already so much interesting stuff to talk about here. Well, I'm obviously going to echo some of the previous comments, and I wanted to start with a story about my dad, Joseph Coyle, born in 1921. And he went to work in a spinning mill in our mill town in Lancashire when he was 14. And he spent all his career until the mid-1970s as a spinner, working on the kind of machines that were invented in the Industrial Revolution by Arkwright. The Second World War took him away, but apart from that, that was what he did. And then the mill closed down in the mid-1970s, as so much of the Lancashire textile industry did. And he was one of the lucky people who got another job. He became a meter reader, but a lot of those people then became unemployed, and actually a lot of their children remained unemployed, and that phenomenon of workless families down the generations got created in the early 1980s recession. But when his mill closed, the machines, the mules, got taken out of the factory and put straight into the textile museum down the road. because they had been installed in the 1950s, and they were second-hand then. They were 1930s machines. And that's an anecdote about the massive underinvestment in capital equipment that has characterized the British economy for decades. In 1945, Keynes, who Richard mentioned earlier, wrote a memo to the War Cabinet. He said, if by some sad geographical slip the American Air Force, for it's now too late to hope for much from the enemy, were to destroy every factory on the northeast coast and in Lancashire, at a time when the directors were sitting there and no one else, we should have nothing to fear. Because his fear, and it proved true, was that Britain's ability to export after the war was going to be absolutely compromised by the inadequacy of capital investment in British factories. They were uncompetitive. And that is the problem. He called it antiquated inefficiency, and that antiquated inefficiency is Britain's low productivity problem, that low level of productivity. Not constantly, because we've had periods of investment, but labour productivity is really about having enough capital equipment. Just as it's much more efficient to clean your house with a vacuum cleaner than a dustpan and brush, you need the capital equipment to be a productive worker. And of course, the skills that you have and the effort that you put into it matter as well. But the big difference between countries in the level of productivity is about how much capital do the workers have to work with. And being productive matters because that's what turns into higher living standards over time and higher wages over time. And living standards don't go up unless we have that productivity growth, because that's what pays people, that's what creates the prosperity. So we need a lot more robots, we need a lot more investment in them. But what we also need is a different division between profits and wages and how those gains from automation are going to get shared out. And it does require skills to change, just as in the early 20th century, industrial discipline meant that workers needed a different level of literacy and numeracy and basic discipline that hadn't been required before. So there are some skills required, and they are non-routine skills. And we have an education system that teaches young people to be not very good in rather expensive computers, and doesn't emphasize enough the non-routine skills, the range of skills that are not all cognitive skills. So there's a problem there, a problem about skills. And what we need to do is move Britain from being a low-skill, low-capital economy to a high-skill, high-capital and productive economy. Now, is this different? A couple of people have already mentioned that we've had these episodes of automation before and the same kind of fears about jobs. And there are some differences. As Debra said to start out, there's the global labour force, so that is making the downward pressure on wages quite intense. And the speed of technological advance is rapid now as well. There's a very interesting book by Eric Brynjolfsson and Andrew McAfee called The Second Machine Age, where they talk through the technicalities of why the speed of technical progress is changing and much more challenging to deal with this time. But I think there are two real challenges for us. First of all, we need to get the investment in the robots by British companies, and investment performance has been absolutely dismal. One argument about why that's the case is that companies don't expect in this very low growth environment to have a market for their products. And I don't buy that, because there's never a market out there for new products and innovations. You've always got to create it. And of course, the general state of demand in the economy matters, but it's actually the ideas and the innovation and the investment that matters more in driving it. And I would start by looking at executive pay, because executives reward themselves with long-term share options, so all their incentives are about getting the share price up. And you can do that by having your company taken over, or you can do that by using the profits that you make to buy back shares that are out in the market. And that's what they've been doing. They've not been investing the money. So the first thing we need to do is use company legislation to link executive pay to investment in real assets and not fiddling with the share price. The second thing is the distribution of productivity gains between capital and labour. And they've been going in profits, and wages have been stagnant since at least the financial crisis, and in the United States since long before that. And the model there is surely Henry Ford, who realised that he needed to pay his workers enough that they could buy the cars that were rolling off his production lines. And it's a famous insight. When he did that, he was sued by Dodge, which had a 10% stake in the Ford Motor Company, because they said that was going to damage the value of their investment. And they were early adherents of the concept that now dominates the thinking about this, which is shareholder value. And I think we have to get away from that. It's about the politics of inequality, and I absolutely agree with Debra saying the decision to automate is not just an economic decision, but a political decision as well. And we've got to think, as Gavin was saying, about the institutions around that. We've been pretty dreadful in past episodes of automation and industrial upheaval at looking after the people whose jobs are made redundant by the new technologies. Really dreadful at that. And we have to think about that. But it's about distribution, stupid. It's not the robots who are sitting around in cocktail parties at Davos drinking glasses of champagne. It's executives. And it's actually really about making sure that we have the gains, but then making sure that they're shared fairly. And I don't think the robots have anything to do with that. It's the people.
Thank you. I'd now like to open out to the floor and ask people to put their hands up if they've got a question. We've got a microphone. I'll ask a very quick one while the microphones are coming. How just very briefly, so we can get to the floor, but what would each member of the panel's prediction be in terms of the effects of this on inequality? I think, Diane, your position was quite clear, but I've also read some stuff that says that we shouldn't think about this as only eroding this sort of unskilled jobs, which is, I think, something you mentioned. Apparently, for example, that there's a sort of list of probabilities of how likely jobs are to be automated, and things like a hairdresser, fireman come very, very low down. And actually things like corporate law, which is very highly paid but involves reading sort of thousands of documents, actually you can mechanise that. So should we be, are you, in terms of the optimism-pessimism scale, where are the panel in terms of the effects of this on inequality?
I think in terms of inequality, again, it depends upon the politics of the decision-making, in terms of what kinds of investment there'll be in, and in which areas, and which jobs are seen as ones that can be automated and not. So if labour is cheap, there's less drive to automate it because of the investment that's needed, and therefore the benefits. But at the same time, there's obviously going to be a real reluctance to automate something like decision makers in finance. I was at a conference in New York last week, and there was a law professor, Frank Pascal, and he said, maybe the people that we should be automating are the ones that make the financial decisions, the ones that use criteria simply based on delivering shareholder value on really kind of dodgy foundations. Maybe that should be automated, but I think that's unlikely.
Okay.
I'm not sure how to answer the question, because I think it depends on which inequalities we're interested in and over what time period, for that matter. Do you want domestic, global, or
income inequality?
but
within,
for whom? I mean, so I think that one of the things that global inequality, I think, in the end, will be reduced, and indeed, whether domestic inequality comes down depends entirely on our willingness and ability to attack the vested interests that are in this, and our tradition of underinvestment, which Diane has so eloquently described, is actually, or has been all about protecting vested interests. So if we're willing to be a bit more radical and a bit more willing to stand up to those vested interests, abolish the Department for Business Innovation and Skills, for example, which is all about protecting vested interests, in my view, then we can reduce inequality.
Okay, thank you. Briefly.
It's hard to see how, if you have a big step up in the use of automation, that it's not going to increase returns to high-skilled workers overall, on average. So that bodes poorly. The caveat to that would be that if you do have a sort of more democratisation of economic risk because some current professional roles are put in jeopardy, then that obviously could have quite an unpredictable impact on the politics of the welfare system. If people are suddenly feeling threatened and are looking for forms of security and insurance that they're not currently on offer, then that can change the political dynamic. I don't think it's unlikely to reduce inequality greatly, but that could shift things. My final point, just to echo Diane, is let's not make the robots the fool guy in the whole inequality story. The reason why the top 1% have done so well in the last 15 years, and 60% of all the gains in the top 1% are in finance, is that robots? Not really. A little bit of technology is relevant. That's kind of rapacious near-criminal rent-seeking, if you ask me. And to lay that at the door of the robot is completely missed the point.
you're highlighting the political dimension to all of this, and the issue of the capability of our democratic institutions to tackle these issues has been flagged up. After what was to me a deeply dispiriting national election campaign in 2010, when the three major parties all seemed to be conspiring with one another to not talk about these sort of things, do you have any confidence whatsoever that the general election campaign for 2015 is going to provide any basis for our future elected leaders to engage seriously with these issues?
If you're asking me, am I optimistic that the sorts of issues that we're kicking around this morning are going to be on display over the next 5 months in the run-up to the next election in a meaningful way, and the political choices underneath them, the answer to that is an emphatic no.
It's interesting, though, isn't it, that anywhere you go and talk to people, audiences like this, everybody recognises that the issues and the kind of dialogue that's going on isn't appropriate to the reality. So at some point, I guess I do remain optimistic that the politics will catch up with the reality and we'll have this kind of conversation. But the thing about vested interests, powerful vested interests, is that they're powerful and highly effective. And I've been quite surprised at how little political response there has been to the financial crisis and the fear, really, of tackling the wishes of the financial industry to have things structured in their interests.
I have absolutely no faith whatsoever in the political leaders to deal with these kinds of issues. So I think that the only change really can come from the bottom up. Because as you say, when you actually speak to people every day, people are well aware of these issues, but there's just a massive disconnect going on.
Do we get the politics we deserve? So it's up to us, the people, if you like, to raise these issues and to create different opportunities for different approaches. I think if we just rely upon, say, the political leaders, the vested interests, to be turkeys voting for Christmas, that's not going to happen.
Hello, I'm Sebastian Braddock. I'd like to put a slightly more blue sky view, which may well be beyond the purview of this actual talk itself. I'd like to put forward to the panel the idea that as we move, we can quibble and quill it on the actual figures, as we move towards an economy and a society where the productivity is tending towards infinity in its ideal form, where we actually don't have to have any workers who are human within the economy, and where we just automate every single job. Shouldn't we be moving away from the thinking of labour markets and market forces and starting to think about the dissociation of remuneration from the actual labour costs involved? I'm going to take a very personal example. In Switzerland recently there was a referendum to replace all benefits with one blanket income of 25,000 francs per annum, which regardless of income, regardless of social status. And shouldn't we, instead of talking about how the increase in automation will affect the jobs market, shouldn't we be talking about the fact that the jobs market may well be done away with entirely, and we have a society where one doesn't have to work to live?
That's a great question. That is a great question. Because it's odd, isn't it, that if you just had a labour market and you had one robot, then that would seem to make you unambiguously better off. There'd be one person, there's one robot, it can replace a person, it can do all that person's job, and then you can have a day of labour. So when we get robots right across the economy, and this is another thing that Keynes predicted, we could go to a 3-day week, maybe a 2-day week. Why can't we do that as humans? Is it because we compete with one another to drive wages down? Why can't we end up in this sort of idealistic world that Sebastian sets out?
Because we continually use the spare labour to come up with other stuff.
things we want.
We create other ideas and other things that we want. This is exactly the hypothesis that was around in the 50s, that you would all production was thought of as manufacturing things. The robots would make the things. Everybody could sit back and enjoy leisure, and you'd pay people to do, if work had some kind of general benefit, then you pay people to do things which are fundamentally useless. That's not what happened, because we came up with liberating creativity didn't reduce the amount of work people wanted to do. It just created new ideas of the sorts of things, services, activities that people want. Now, you can argue, of course, that all those wants are somehow fake, that we don't really want, I don't really want this. I don't imagine how I could do without it, actually. I don't want my iPad, I don't want my MacBook or any of these things. Actually, the kind of things that I want, and I can imagine all kinds of other things that I would like to have that I don't currently have, and that with new ideas and new production technologies and new robots, I can imagine a world which would be very different. But I cannot imagine a world in which we don't need people to have those ideas and have them to work. Now, that may be my lack of imagination. Yep. It may be that in the end, the AIs will take over the world and they will be having the ideas and they will be better ideas than my ideas. But at the moment, I can't imagine that, and I think we are a world away from that at the moment. So I imagine a role for human work.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think work gets redefined. A basic income is a very interesting idea, and that's a separate sort of issue. I'm not dismissing that idea. Surely there are people here who had to explain to their granny what their job is and can't quite manage it. Oh, I do SEO optimization, or I'm a web designer. Because we need that sense of purpose in life, that's what gets redefined as work as time goes by.
I mean, on a trivial level, in terms of people being replaced by robots, just experiences of trying to ring the bank and the kinds of decision trees that you have to, that you're forced down. And sometimes those kind of automated messages are very, very frustrating. So we actually like human interaction anyway. But again, this issue of work being separate from remuneration is a very interesting one. So maybe in the future, it's possible, if there is capital investment, that we could move towards using more robots, but rather than having an 8-hour working day, we could move to a 4-hour working day and earn a decent living from that.
I think we run the danger of being myopic and not lacking in empathy. If I put myself in a worker's position entering a labor market, you have the large corporation which wants to hire me but wants to pay me as little as possible, give me minimum labor rights, only what the law says. Yep. They want all the skills in the world from me. They don't want to spend anything on me on training, they just want me ready-made. If in that world they would pay me very little, then I would go home, and I turn around, and they want me to spend like crazy. Spend, spend, spend all day long, consume, consume, consume. If I haven't got the money, they want me to go borrow it. Now, how do you square this circle? With robots, I'm competing 2 ways. I'm competing with cheap labor in the third world, and I'm also competing with robots now. Now, basic problem is robots are not like humans. They don't consume the way humans do. Now, governments want to have minimum to do with workers, reduce their rights. Now, how do you square this circle?
Well, I don't think any of us disagree with the proposition that the challenge here is to make sure that people get paid decently and have decent working conditions. But the point is that that's nothing to do with investing in the robots. That's to do with the institutions and the political arrangements that we have. And I was trying very hard not to lack empathy and saying that we've been very bad in the past at helping people get through these transitions in the way the labour market and industry works when their jobs vanish. And we really have to do much better than that. And I think, none of us is wildly optimistic about the politics of getting that to happen. But over the longer term, the productivity gains come from that investment in technology. So if you want to see rising living standards, access to new goods and services over the longer term, then you've got to have that investment at some point.
There's another element to the conundrum as well, which we ought to include here, which is that the thing rests on if you like, the profit-wage split here, because, and it's so I can't remember which of you mentioned the Ford example, and you realise that if you paid wages, decent wages, people could buy the cars. But there's another bit which is about retirement and indeed education. At either end, when you're not working, how are we paying for that? Now, you can see investment in skills and education, but Many of us, many of us are in this room have got grey hair and want to have a pension, and the pension itself depends on investment and depends on the ability to create product and savings, which enable us then to pay pensions at the end of that period. So that's where the shareholder value thing actually comes back in, and we need to think about that too. So it's not just a question of who gets it, it's how do we generate the savings and the benefits from those profits as well. So we need to get it right at both ends.
I'm absolutely delighted that somebody else has mentioned the citizens' income. Perhaps a less radical solution might be the use of workers' cooperatives, which ensure that the benefits of mechanisation accrue to the workers whose jobs are being replaced rather than shareholders. How do you feel that that's feasible or desirable?
Yes.
Well, I don't agree. I wish I did. The trouble is that the examples, they're not very thick on the ground. And quite a lot of places where it's been tried, it's ended up in a bit of a disaster. Sometimes there have been rescues, it's true, so that's harder to know whether you'd go that way. But there are very, very few examples of successful cooperatives. And we all look at John Lewis, for example. But I mean, apart from that, the other cooperatives were all things like building societies, and they're financial ones, but they're not really productive organisations. There are very few that really get it together. So I think we need to think quite, you need to be, it's a high-risk strategy, I think, to think that co-ops will be the answer.
There have at times been big tax incentives for share ownership schemes to get more towards that kind of worker ownership structure. And they didn't work very well either. But having said that, having a different mix of organisational structures in business would be quite healthy. I think having all of them tending to get bigger and bigger and be very focused on the share price in the stock market is not healthy. So a sort of mixed picture, a mixed ecology of types of business would be good. But I like Bridget, don't see cooperatives as being the only solution.
But I mean, Gavin, you've worked, for example, on policy for a long time, and a pure sort of economic view would say, look, we're hearing a lot about these kind of evil firms and bosses and owners and so on. Firms are just owned by the people, right? So there is some benefit that comes from the economy, and it can be divided between capital and labour. And so if we can just actually sort out an employee share ownership scheme across the economy, so many more people own shares in many different companies, then won't the benefits to mechanisation and technology just be more evenly distributed?
I'm kind of with the panel and being sceptical about the end of work, I'm afraid, to the guy who asked the question. There was a gentleman who asked the question earlier. But you and the other gentleman raised the issue of a citizen's income, which kind of connects with your point, Richard, about how we share the fruits of growth more creatively, if you like. Is it possible to do so, or is that just not sort of part of the market economy game? And I'm sort of, in terms of where I come from, so I spent 3 years of my life battling away to get something called the Child Trust Fund up and running, which the Child Trust Fund was an attempt to create a universal, very modest, universal capital asset in the hands of every young person in this country. Kind of romantic idea in a way, and it kind of crashed directly into a very unromantic period of austerity and cutbacks and so on. But it was and I'm lurking right behind that was the notion, in some sense, that as we get richer as a country, one small sliver of that greater prosperity might find itself shared equally into the pockets of, in this case, young people, unconnected from the world of work. So it would just be a sliver of the nation's wealth, which would be there for you to build whatever opportunities you so wish, and it would be unrelated to remuneration from work. And I think that is, over the longer term, that sort of approach, which connects to it, that was a capital asset rather than an income flow, but the difference isn't that deep, really. I think there is something in that. I have to say, in terms of raw politics, the idea that you get something unconditionally in this country, unrelated to work, is profoundly unpopular. I mean, I've sat in more focus groups on this sort of thing than I care to remember, and people want attachment for any sort of reward, any sort of payment to the world of work. And so we bumped into, if you like, something which seems to run quite deep in the British psyche, at least. So I believe in it. I'm not particularly optimistic about the politics of bringing it back. But just to connect to the point about kind of ownership of capital and alternative forms. I suppose I do believe a bit in kind of path dependency of sort of organisational structures. So I think I don't think any government's going to suddenly say we've had enough of the PLC and we're going to sort of, in a very robust way, try and create new forms of very strong incentives for workers' co-ops or anything else. But I do think there is a role for the state to be a promoter of diversity rather than uniformity. I think economies which have different forms of economic organisation are generally more robust for the future than those which don't. And so I think, if anything, I would constantly be tilting in terms of public policy towards encouraging whether it's more workers' co-ops or whatever else. And some of them will go wrong, and I think that's probably a price worth paying.
I better declare that I'm Tony Dyer and I'm the Green Party candidate for Bristol South.
Lots of technology.
And I think I'll also point out that citizens' income is actually one of our policies, and that we will be introducing citizens' income if we get the opportunity to do so. Not so much as a replacement for work, but as support for those people who are unable to access work. My question is a more broader one. I think it goes back to a comment earlier about as we automate some activities, we create innovation in other areas. And I guess my question is all innovation good? And the reason I ask that is it seems that a lot of the innovation that's been created in recent times are areas such as in the derivatives markets, creating lots of innovation that has little or no social value and has helped contribute towards the major crisis. And as we hear from Debra just now, innovation now in how we stop people being able to get access to workers' rights and a decent level of payment for the work they do. When we look at the mechanical Turk example. So my question is all innovation good? How do we stop the innovation that is not so good?
Debra, you were the pessimist on the panel, so.
I don't think all innovation is good, no. And I think that there's a problem in that there's a mindset that all innovation is good, enterprise is good, entrepreneurs are something that we should prize. And I think there's other ways of thinking about things. And so I think we have to take a step back and be a little bit more critical about the kind of innovations that we want to support. Even in my own university, innovation is a real buzzword, and anything that's innovative, people are supporting and backing without question. And I think that we just need to give this some more thought.
I think we need to distinguish between invention, innovation, and indeed sort of establishment and turning innovation into business as usual. All invention is good. Invention is a human activity and needs to be continually supported. As it turns into innovation, in other words, there's an application of a new idea, then a lot of that is experimental and most of them actually fail. So, in fact, there's a huge amount of innovation which never really kind of gets going, doesn't cascade through the system. The ones that cascade, I think then it's not so much a question of are they good or bad, it's how are you using them. So again, I want to distinguish, I don't think it's to say that you shouldn't be thinking about making innovations, having new ideas, getting them out there into the marketplace. It's the criteria by which we think that they become established or not established. In fact, many of the things that people said were innovations in financial services weren't really innovations at all. The only way in which there was real innovation was the establishment of digital platforms and much speedier transactions. Now that applies to a whole lot of other aspects of life that we probably value quite a lot, the ability to go online and find things and get better prices for things that we couldn't do before. So the fundamental innovation is how is kind of has benefits, positive things and probably some negative things, and it's how you use it, it's how you apply it that really matters. And that's the bit that you need to think about harder.
And finance probably stands out as a sector where innovations or change have least well served the population in general. And I'm not entirely clear on the reasons for it. I think it's partly to do with a lack of competition and the way the sector has grown a structure of regulation that suits the people who work in it and not anybody else. But it's a very different case study from other sectors. We need a lot of innovation in green technology.
My name is Leyland. I gave up this morning to attend. I could have attended something in Bath, which is the psychoanalyst v. the big picture thinker. So the psychoanalysis of the big picture thinker. So I came here instead, but I offer you a big picture. and I promise I do have a question, and this is not going to be interminable, but my big picture is more like a jigsaw puzzle rather than straight lines, and your joined up thinking seems to end in a kind of an idealism that doesn't get examined. So I'd offer this as sort of the bigger picture, frame of the bigger picture. Francis Fukuyama has just said that he relies on the future of the big state, the strong state, which might be called China envy. Right? That's the one thing. And in Ukraine, Syria, everywhere, we know that the popular uprising against the tyrant ends in fact, there's a quotation, says they revenge themselves against tyranny by destroying civilization. So the idea that we're going to have some sort of democratic popular vote to get rid of the big state when it's achieved, and it's happening rapidly, I think is an idealism that is without foundation, because it comes back to the destruction of civilization. That's what's happening. The problem is painting ourselves, and it hasn't been talked about, although it was alluded to, painting ourselves into a corner. The question about trial and error experimentation, which has happened since the Stone Age. So if you have hindsight bias, if you say, oh, well, we've survived so far, so we'll survive in the future. I mean, apart from being a psychological state, that sort of answer, is that it's breakless. And you paint yourself into a corner, because what will happen is not the skilled jobs that the robots will replace, it'll do everything else but the high-skilled, high-technology robots. It'll be the stupid stuff that gets replaced. And it gets replaced in a breakless sense, and we paint ourselves into a corner. And the last thing that we'll be left with imagination. But rather than have that imagination as a recipe to help design the future, it'll be left as a garnish. It'll be too late, because we've painted ourselves into a corner where we're sitting there twiddling our thumbs, taking our soma, practicing imagination, but everything else is done. So that's the problem. We paint ourselves into a corner. And as we've seen, I don't know if you've seen, and I'll come to a close now. I'm going on too long. If you've seen 12 Years a Slave, most people have seen that film, I presume. The key point for me was the woman lead explaining that she'd left the plantation to get a bar of soap, and she was punished for leaving the plantation, and her only reward was a bar of soap. So the picture of Amartya Sen, the economist, saying broadly in his book Justice, on justice, was lessen the injustice slightly. That's his ambition, to lessen the injustice in the world, of unjust world, slightly. That's the bar of soap. So that's the future we're heading. Once you've included those scenarios, everything you've been saying is just wildly optimistic. Face the reality. The idea of a popular uprising will destroy civilization.
It isn't often the economists get painted as the crazy idealists, I have to say, so that's quite a change. Maybe you're right, we're looking at the end of civilization, but for myself, I'm just going to carry on trying to get things better step by step, because I can't think of anything else to do.
I'd like to say I disagree that it's robots that will be doing all the stupid stuff. I don't think that is the case. I think what's key to this is that it isn't that graduate jobs or high-skilled jobs are hard to automate. They aren't. It depends on what kind of skills they are doing. And so some jobs are easier to use robots for than others, and it could be low skill and it could be high skill. And that's why it is a political decision about what kind of jobs we do decide, what kinds of decisions are made in terms of what kind of jobs that robots will do. So I don't think it's that robots will do all the stupid stuff and all the high-skilled jobs will be left. I think it could be really quite mixed.
the big job growth we've seen over the last sort of 5 years, and I see no particular reason why this is likely to change in the next 5 years, cleaning, hospitality, care, low-paid, currently low productivity, service sector jobs, basically very little being to a very small degree being touched by automation at all. I see every reason for that continuing, and the choice, and to pose the kind of challenge to us as, well, that's all about technology and those roles are going to go, I think, for me, is to completely miss the point. The point on those roles is how much as a society are we willing to pay? And what are we willing to do to try and improve the skills for those people? These are non-traded sectors. They're not likely to be automated away. And we have a choice to make about the plight of the people who work in those sectors and what we do about it. And to sort of pretend that we don't because those roles might disappear because of automation, I think is sort of wildly inaccurate.
There's a big kind of implication in all of this as well about, you mentioned the dustpan and brush versus the vacuum cleaner earlier, Diane, and I think that's actually very important. One of the big changes that happened in a developed society was exactly that, and the liberation of time in those domestic tasks which existed as a result. Fitted carpets and a Hoover were a fantastic time saving and a fantastic increase in cleanliness in people's houses, and made it possible for women to do a whole variety of other things, including being educated and going out to work, that they were not able to do before. It's all kind of things, it's under the radar, isn't it? 'Cause it's not big and sexy, but actually incredibly important. Closed stoves earlier, cookers. In developing countries, the ability to cook cleanly and not be poisoned by your cooking fuel is still fantastically important and a major technological advance. And those sorts of small things which actually are going on, and we take all that stuff for granted in this country. We are incredibly lucky. We may complain about our institutions, but actually, compared to many countries, they're enormously effective. And indeed in the rest of Western Europe as well. So we can make them better, and we shouldn't be complacent. But there's still lots of countries where there is small technology and small technology changes which need to be implemented and which slowly are being implemented and we should be supporting, which will make a massive change to far more people's lives than is available to us in this country alone.
Yeah. So just a quick point on financial innovation. In the 1980s, economist Kenneth Galbraith said that there's no such thing as financial innovation. There's just different ways to dress up debt, which I thought was interesting and probably quite correct.
Yeah.
There's the question I actually wanted to ask was about the role of globalization in all of this. A lot of the panelists are talking about different policies that we can bring in to change the distribution of wages and profits, for example, and lots of other types of policies. I want to know, to what extent does globalization prohibit that? But also, to what extent does it actually improve our abilities to bring in those policies? It's been touched on globalization, but I'd like to delve in further.
Could you say a bit more about what you mean in terms of enabling?
So, for example, let's say I think it was Diane's idea that executive pay should be based on the amount of investment that we put in, not on the share price. Well, if you instituted that, there could be an exodus of companies that don't necessarily want to invest in this climate to other countries where they're not required to for their compensation to remain as high as it is. If you instituted something where you required companies to pay a higher proportion of their wages, of their profits to wages, again, the same thing could happen. But then there may be ways that globalization could spur increased investment, for example.
Okay, so that's a great question for the panel. I mean, are there parallels here with something like tax competition, where economists originally thought tax competition would be a good thing because everybody will want to have an efficient tax system, and that sort of marginal rates will come down, and you'll end up with the ideal of a broad base and a low rate, which is sort of most people agree is a good thing. Actually, that's not the way tax competition works at all. People free ride. Will globalization actually pose a problem to people that want to put in reforms to get the most from technology?
Obviously, yes, in some ways, and tax is a good example, and it's proving quite difficult for governments to cooperate with each other through organisations like the OECD to address this tax competition, I forget which way around it, avoidance or evasion practices. But they're slowly making progress on that. If you look at other areas like executive pay, I'm a bit sceptical about the degree to which high-paid executives would get competed away to other countries. But as I'm an economist and I believe in markets, I'm quite happy to test the market in that and just try it and see how many of them do get competed away. I don't think it'll be many. And although obviously investment is footloose to some degree, I think you can exaggerate that. So I don't really see major supermarket chains entirely leaving their market in the UK just because of a change in legislation about what executives can pay themselves. But perhaps that's crazy economic optimism again.
Go on.
Supermarkets are actually much more in trouble because of new technology and the behaviour of all of us as consumers wanting to do our shopping in a different kind of way and saying to supermarkets, actually, we don't want to go to your store anymore. And driving down the value of the assets and the investments that they've made. And that competition is just as important as the, if you like, the global competition. So much activity still happens within a local, don't want to say the nation state because those borders are changing as well, but in a more localized fashion. Where global stuff I think is important is in two senses. One in the sense that bringing countries out of poverty by enabling them to join the world economy and invest in technologies, as I said earlier, that we take for granted is, I think, actually a fantastically important thing to do. And markets actually do make that possible, as well as being the kind of discovery mechanism for new stuff that is going on. And the connections between different countries and the way that that generates different kinds of ideas happening as different aspects of ideas collide, if you like. That's the place where we'll eventually liberate new stuff. It's not a painless process. It may indeed end in disaster. The future is not, I've been an economic forecaster, so I know the future's not predictable. If I get it wrong, if I get it right, it's probably by accident, and the only times I get long-term, you can get long-term trends pretty right. People and productivity equals output, I can do that. I can look at trends for people, I can look at an underlying trend for productivity, and you can be broadly right over the medium term. Get a cycle right? No, it's not possible. There's so many moving parts, so many elements in this particular jigsaw. But I think that the fundamental thing about globalization is that it has enabled already millions of people to be brought out of poverty, and there are millions more where that's possible. And we're seeing that, beginning to see that even now in places like Africa, where people have despaired for generations.
The extent to which globalization is used and the movement of executives is used as a sort of threat. If you like, to policymakers, I think is very real. Policymakers really talk about that stuff and they worry about it. And I just think there's so much mythology. I mean, at the extreme, of course, people will get up and leave and companies will leave. And of course, that's the case in the mobile world. But I think the threat of executive flight is wildly overdone in this country. Wildly overdone. I see very little evidence of it. I absolutely agree with Diane. At some point, it will happen, but in my experience, not much of it ever happened from anything that a public policymaker has done in this country in the last 20 years. So I think that there is a spectre which is used. My other point is, I was trying to think to pick up on the question about examples of where globalization is empowering, if you like, labour at the expense of capital. And it's not so straightforward. It's easy to think about the other way around. I mean, the price of this sort of thing to labour in this country is obviously cheaper because of globalization to a degree. So we all benefit from cheaper products.
But the existence of this kind of thing is liberating communities who don't otherwise have access to a phone system.
So I agree with that. What we don't have, though, is in terms of many examples of where worker, if you like, where the power of the workforce has increased as a result of globalization. And there's been lots, I can remember for many, many years, people have talked about cross-national labour, sort of unions getting together to try and bargain beyond borders. And it's never really happened. But it's an interesting phenomenon in the States with the kind of whole rise of consciousness over low pay and the fight for $15 as a kind of minimum wage, which actually isn't just a kind of fringe thing. That is starting to have real political clout and is changing laws in states as we speak. And it'd be interesting if we got together in a few years' time, but the people who are behind those campaigns are currently in this country trying to organise and motivate and sort of raise, if you like, the aspirations of British trade unionists, in particular, and the people who aren't trade unionised working in service sectors. My guess is it won't lead to much, but it's an interesting question as to whether labour movements start to learn more from successes in other countries' labour movements, because that hasn't been something we've seen to date, but maybe that will change.
But maybe it's more about the power of the consumer. It comes back to the worker-consumer relationship. If consumers, and this is happening, consumers demand products which are made by to particular standards and to particular labour standards.
Then that can be
if you don't buy it, if it's made with child labour or slave labour, then child labour and slave labour will actually disappear eventually.
But if I could just use Apple as an example here. So if you think about that in terms of global supply chains, the iPhone, it costs around $6 to actually manufacture it by Foxconn. So if you look at the actual profit levels that Apple are making, this was on the study which was done on the iPhone 3, Apple were making 65% profit per device, paying $6 for each device to be manufactured. Someone did a thought experiment and said, if this was actually paid by somebody in the US, and they paid them at minimum wage, Apple would still be making 50% profit per device. So there are decisions being made somewhere in terms of where work is going and what kind of labour is being used.
Can we? I think let's collect them in 2s and 3s now. So there were 3 here, and then we'll do 3 over there because we've got.
Hi, Kurt James. This is a question about relating to IBM, who've created an interesting computer-based technology that they call Watson, that has the ability to ingest large amounts of disconnected data, make connections between that data, and make probability-based decisions. That technology was used to beat humans in that game show Jeopardy in America. IBM then put that technology to work. They gave it some money and some human-based friends, and it's been making menus in restaurants, doing cancer-based research, working in medicine as well. As a technology, making decisions, which is what it's doing, based on probability and information, which is kind of what we do. Is this something that, as a technology, that the panel thinks we should embrace, invest in, fear, or regulate?
Great question. Let's collect 2 more, but that's a great question.
I'm Milan and I work in NHS for 25 years, but I also have my companies and doing mobile health lately. It's not mainly the question, it's also statements but I don't have a paper like gentlemen. I mean, the fact of life it is that 5 of you there probably have, each of you have amount of knowledge which is 60, 70 times larger than Alexandrian Library in a time, but none of you is more intelligent than any of the person who was using that library at that given time. And it's fantastic what you are saying, all of those things, but I can't see any of you saying that we need a new Magna Carta. We need something simple, something which is just on 1 page or 2 pages, which can bring humanity to the 22nd century. And also the simplifying of things to the stupidity. As you can remember from history, the little steps, little nudges in a human history made a huge change, like the nation, republic, the way how they forbid inherited wealth to gone down again from generation to generation. Sorry, I have a cold. And then they went down the drain when they changed that, when the people who became rich said, oh, we want that to be inherited. And from 14th, 15th century, on one of the largest cities on earth, they fall down to the rubble. And they still never recovered, or Alexandria, etc., etc. So my question is also, is there any way the intellectuals or whatever businessmen or people can actually do these simple things, make a tax system simple and easier for everybody to understand it, new Magna Carta about human liberties, human rights, and most of everything to stop 0.1% of people forcing their richness to become inherited?
Great questions. Let's answer those 2 then. So Kurt's was about this thing, it's called machine learning, and it's behind, I would say it's not just Watson, it's behind everything on the internet. And it was the discovery, basically in the late 1980s, that rather than impose models on data, which is what economists like to do, data scientists now run these algorithms where they just put all of the data in together. They don't impose any kind of idea of what the result should be, and they just let the computer run on it using something called neural networks. And this black box can come up with incredible predictions and can do these kinds of things. So I guess this would be the sort of thing that could replace high-skilled jobs. So is this something we should fear, embrace, or regulate?
The thing that I can't quite think through about this artificial intelligence, this machine learning, is what they're learning is all the knowledge that's out there already. But will they ever get to a point when they can create new things to know? And I'm just not sure I know the answer to that. I mean, what they're doing is sucking up databases of existing knowledge created by human beings, and I don't know the answer. But if the outcome is, for example, that tired doctors taking decisions can consult a computer for embodied knowledge in some way and use their time instead to communicate and care for their patient, that might be a good outcome of it. But I don't know where it ends up.
Well, there's a really interesting relationship between the two questions that we've just had, because one of them is about how do we get the simple statements and the simple things that we can all kind of get together about. And on the other hand, how do we deal with these really complicated things and very complex models and algorithms that probably most of us will never understand, me included. And therefore, there's something here about the interface between those two things. And actually, I think it comes down to what's the question? Because all of those Watson things and these complex algorithms are put together to answer a question, and the question is asked by somebody. So then the thing is, can we get simple questions to which we can then understand the answers, even if we don't understand all the mechanisms by which we reach those answers? And actually, across human history, we've used shortcuts and we've used rules of thumb and we've used things from the ancestors, or we believe that there was something in the sky that would tell us these answers. We've always thought we don't understand stuff, but nonetheless, we come up with mechanisms of working on that. And the IBM, and whether it's neural nets or other forms of complex systems, algorithms that people are using, there's always going to be that increase in the way that we ask for information. But it comes down to, can we ask a simple enough question that we've got some intuitive sense about how we're understanding the answer? And I think that's a really good challenge, and I don't have an answer to that. I don't think I've, at the moment, got that kind of simple way of looking at the world which says these are the really important things that we should all be able to, or enough of us should be able to hear about to come up with something. So I need to take that away and think about it. Sorry,
I love the idea of a new Magna Carta next year for the anniversary, and maybe somebody'd like to pick that up for the election campaign.
For the 22nd century,
yeah.
For what it's worth, I might give an answer to that one. The panel's done lots of answers. And I take Gavin's skepticism seriously, some of this might be overhyped, but if we take a lot of these things to their natural conclusion, then it actually breaks down economics and moves to a totally new, different form of economics, which was discussed essentially by Coase, who worked on the theory of the firm. And what a lot of these things are doing, if you think, for example, of the technology in taxis, so Lyft, Uber, Halo, and so on, are doing away with a firm, Amazon Turk does this as well, and setting up a bilateral contract between somebody who wants something done and somebody who does something. So the firm goes away. And I think that if this really blossoms and goes to its natural conclusion, then we will actually need a very much simpler state and a much simpler tax system, because if you do away with the firm, you have to simply tax, and you want a safety net of some kind, then you have to move to a world of just simply taxing people and incomes and inputs such as land. And actually, that probably wouldn't be such a bad thing if we ended up there. We got 5 minutes, I think, so let's group together a final set of questions.
Hi, I was struck by something you said earlier about what we're willing to pay for these services, and I just wondered if the human touch might be important. So it's possible to pretty much fly a plane, I believe, automatically now. So that seems to me to be a very high-skilled job that could be done by a robot. But we might want to pay for, cabin crew for that personal touch.
Apparently, you can fly it, but you still need humans to take off, land, and to drive it around the airport.
Yeah. For now.
And I would definitely pay more to have a human pilot on board a plane as well.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you look at Google Cars, for example, and the amount of mileage that they've done, when they're actually testing this, they have people sitting there because, of course, it would freak pedestrians out if they just saw a self-driving car. So I think there's things that we're used to, but also in terms of that human touch, it's not just mechanical things, is it? It is caring for people as well.
And I think, a range of services, if you want the cheap service, you get the automated voicemail system that you've got to navigate through. But if you are willing to pay more for it, you can speak to a human being in the call centre.
I think that's one of the really big questions for us in the next generation is what price are we willing to pay for that? And we don't really know. But I can definitely imagine moving to more of a world where the people who have the money and are willing to who value it enough get the human touch. And more people and more basic services interact with basically machines and don't pay quite so much. And I mean, we'll see how we adjust and whether or not we continue over years to come to value that human touch. And maybe it's a transition thing because maybe we're kind of used to it and therefore we think it matters in some net services where, frankly, in the future we'll care less. I don't know. But I think that is really one of the big questions about the kind of transition we're likely to be going through.
You just need to ask your children how tomorrow will look like. Because all of you there are, no offense, middle-aged like myself. And that's also the tragedy, because the middle-aged cannot make a future Magna Carta. It will be one in their 20s.
It needs imagination, not trial and error.
Maybe somebody in their 20s wants to chip in.
Yeah.
Not quite my 20s, I'm somewhere off that. I'm 17, incidentally. But he mentioned the new Magna Carta, a new Magna Carta of human liberties and human rights. Isn't that already the UN Declaration of Human Rights? We already have what is essentially intended to be a manifesto for the better world, for the world of tomorrow. And yet, for the most part, I find that there are abuses of the Declaration of Human Rights which go right throughout the system. It doesn't matter whether we're talking about the developing world, we're talking about the developed world, or the post-industrial world. Throughout, we have abuses of the system, of the populations, on behalf of companies, on behalf of firms, on behalf of individuals, on behalf of the state themselves. The fact is, the 20-year-olds, the 17-year-olds of today do not have the power to take on the vested interests of those who are typically older, who are taxpayers per se, and who have most of the voting power, especially in the developed world. If we're going to talk about demographics, we might as well move on to the demographic time bomb that is our aging population. As the share of the vote gets skewed more and more towards old people, UKIP's natural constituency, I might add, as this share of the vote gets skewed towards this, we end up with a situation in which we have an alienation of the youth, where the youth are made to work for the benefit of the old people, their pensions, their healthcare, and quite often any decisions, any political bonuses given as an appeasement to the electorate.
I'd just like to thank everybody for turning up. It was a really interesting conversation, and to thank everybody on the panel.